so said. Few days, few months out, and leave that floor. He will come in the market. Yes, we all know that. We're just come back. Yeah. Come to your course. Oh, she's leading it. She doesn't. Maybe next Saturday. Yeah, discussion on it. Something to discussion on this. So what of the Cleverlands, which part of the world is where it belongs to, why they're different. The very last question. They use our system, but they do better than ours. Things we talked all the way from now. You choose that, yes, and everything will change.
Post a picture outside his flat window, and you can't see more than 30 metres, maybe from the
Goodness me, and a kind of a hush descended on the room automatically. Welcome everyone to a very well-subscribed event today. I promise to be completely incoherent, having just travelled half around the world with Jane Mann, colleague from CUP, to talk about textbooks in Bangkok, but it's nothing compared with the travelling that Lucy has done. So I stand in awe of her ability to have travelled the globe. Actually, sitting next to Simon Liebes, you've probably got more air miles between you than any two people I know. Some very practical things just to start off with. So please switch your phones to silent, but don't turn them off. Bearing in mind my son has just moved my phone to the nuclear alert sign, I'll make sure that mine is off. Get involved with the reason for not switching them on is do get involved with the conversation online. That's the hashtag, so #EdLive, using that one. And we are being filmed. This is quite important because we found that a number of the lectures have been filmed and then accessed an awful lot by a very large number of people. We choose the lectures very carefully. Often they articulate with some very pressing issues, like Helena Badsley's work on working memory. And that topicality or saliency is followed through into filming it and then making it very widely available globally. So the video will be available on the Cambridge Assessment website next week. We do have a photographer clicking away. Yes, click, click. And if you'd prefer that we don't use your photograph, I mean, I'm pretty bad from any angle, in the external publicity, please let one of the network team know. So Rosie or Carrie at the back. Just let them know after the seminar. We're also involved in something quite interesting, which is A101. Now that sounds like Room 101. It's not. It comes from D101, which was the Open University Introduction to Social Science, which was a really interesting introductory compendium to all the key concepts in social science for Open University students. And the Open University really scratched its head after the first year because they had 2,500 students and they'd sold over 100,000 copies. And it turns out it was such a good introduction that it was used by undergraduates right the way through England and then through the world. We want to try and do the same with A101, which is an introduction to the principles of assessment. We don't want to monetize desperately what we do. What we want to do is to really get understanding of assessment out there, particularly amongst teachers. And our concern to do that has been vindicated by the trialling. We wanted to trial it with just a few hundred people, and we've had just thousands of people interested in trialling it. So that will be coming in a launch next year, and the leaflets for that are downstairs. Another plug is that, in that bag are some copies of Cleverlands. For those of you who actually continue to read paper rather than tire your minds and fail to actually comprehend things on the screen, here is a real thing, a book.
There's an e-book as well, too.
Yeah. Read the real one. It's just so much nicer. And it's a special edition, isn't it? The ones in with a rather nice inside cover. Now that's it for the practicalities. Other than the fire exits, there is no fire practice planned. So if the fire alarm does go off, which is a continuous sound, then the exits are there, and we gather on the recently tended lawns outside. That's the A101, Introducing the Principles of Assessment leaflet available downstairs. Right, so, Lucy. You've travelled the globe, but I just thought, the book was launched earlier in the year, and publishers do very little now, actually. If any of you have been involved in writing a text, they love you writing them and do nothing to promote them. And the authors wind up doing all of the promotion. It's exhausting. So we have many colleagues who have done this. It's not good, actually, because it means that knowledge is not disseminated in quite the way that Gutenberg intended. Books are a fantastic medium for knowledge being transmitted around the world. And yes, looking sternly at you, Elizabeth, the publishers need to do more in promoting the things that they've commissioned. Now, so I thought earlier in the year there was a very, very good launch at Policy Exchange, a lot of interest, but let's have something in November. Let's do it again. Because this is impressive, this work, and it's impressive for a very specific reason. It's like an educational odyssey, somebody relatively young, compared with some of us in the room, Lucy, who became frustrated and therefore interested in education, and capitalised on links or hassled people in schools around the world to allow to teach and gain some experience. But that was turned not into an odyssey with just sirens on rocks, it was turned into something scientific. It is, I think, a prima facie exercise in compelling social science. So of course we have observation bias. When we go around the world, we look for certain things. We don't look for certain things, so we don't notice them. Sometimes we notice things that we haven't looked for. But what Lucy did was to go and experience and immerse herself in educational realities in different contexts. And then, with intellectual curiosity, access additional theory to the theory that she took to those experiences to seek to explain the things that she had experienced. And in my mind, it makes it an extraordinary journey of an illuminating kind, informed by some of the best research into educational practice. But because it was driven by the phenomena, she experienced it and sought to explain it, it is very wide-ranging in its considerations. Of course, it's full of judgment, but it is very wide-ranging in the way in which it brings theory to bear to explain what was actually happening in the contexts. And from that, I think, comes some very interesting insights. Lucy and I spent many hours discussing the book. I wanted her to leave a far more personal experience into it, but it would have been twice the size, I think, had you done that. As it is, it contains some lovely anecdotes which take you into the lived experience of teaching in these particular classrooms, in these schools, in these systems, with all of the things impinging on it, ideas of ability, the culture of the locality, the culture of youth society, the parental expectations. It brings all of those to bear. But it doesn't simply provide us with descriptions informed by theory. I think within it there are some startling insights. I'm not going to go through them because you will hear some of them tonight. But for me, the standout one, which I've stolen relentlessly, usually attributed, is about culture. Because so many comparativists say, it's jolly interesting going to another nation and observing it, but you can't draw anything from it because it is culturally so specific. It's interesting, but not generalizable. But you'll find in Cleverlands something which is, I think, profoundly insightful in terms of culture. Because Lucy says, hell, a school is an institution. The whole point is, it's an institution with particular rules. It is a place where there is a culture. That culture can be changed by the actions of the actors within that institution. The managers, the leaders, the teachers, the technical staff supporting the teaching, the students themselves, the alumni, and so on. Now, in other words, culture is not something that we just take for granted and which can roll on relentlessly by itself. It's something that we can manage within the school. And that includes things like ideas about ability. So I think from this, we not only get an insight into other systems informed by theory, but we also get, through, I think, very good social science, some startling insights which can inform extremely progressive new policy in our and other settings around the world. So without any further rambling from me in a kind of a haze of jet lag, Lucy, over to you. I won't say much about you other than to say that you did this. You were then, I think, probably provided with more job offers than I've seen many people being given, most of which you refuse because you want to remain relatively independent and free-flowing through the system. So, Lucy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Tim. It's quite a beginning, quite a lot to live up to. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming to see what I have to say today. So I'm going to launch right in with why I'm here in the first place. And that is that I started as a teacher. I taught science and psychology A-level in a school in southwest London, in a fairly challenging area. And by year 3, I'd become a little bit disillusioned with aspects of the English education system. Of course it was challenging. Teaching is challenging even if you're an experienced teacher, and I'd only been there for 3 years. But it wasn't only challenging because of the students who brought their own challenges, many of them from home. But it was challenging because certain things that were being put into place by the school leader, in turn, because of the kind of things that she was hearing from the policy, from what she perceived Ofsted wanted, I didn't think were necessarily the best for the children in our care. So that got me interested in education systems, in education policies, and I went to study just down the road, in fact, came to do a master's in education here. And I read a lot about top performing education systems, top performing as defined by PISA. And politicians at the time, so at the time we had Michael Gove, talking a lot about PISA, and that this is the reason that we are going to strengthen the league tables is because this is what the top performing schools are doing. So I focused on accountability in my master's and read a bit more about what different countries are doing. But despite having read a fair bit about them, I didn't really feel I could fully understand what was going on in that country. Because, of course, a single policy, if you look through a single lens, such as accountability or assessment or even pedagogy, which obviously has a huge impact on children, you can't really get a good idea of what the whole picture looks like unless you also look at how it sits with other policies in a particular context. So I decided that age 26, I think I had nothing to lose. I just finished my master's. I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't have children, didn't have any romantic interests at the time. I thought, you know what, I'm completely free. I had some savings from living with my parents while I was teaching. And I thought, I'm going to go and have a look at these different countries. I'm going to volunteer to teach in their schools. And if that fails, because they may well say no chance, I'm going to sit in coffee shops with a big sign. This is me with a sign on my back. The sign says, "Hello, I'm Lucy. I'm a teacher from England. I'd like to hear about education in your country. Please come and talk to me." And that is me in Finland talking to a Finnish parent. So I literally walked around with the sign stuck to my back. But I also, sat in coffee shops in all the countries I went to, except China, because I wasn't on the right visa, and there were policemen everywhere. But I decided that was a strategy. But more than that, I was very lucky in that educators are very generous. And I'd reached out through a variety of means, through emails, friends of friends, of aunties of friends, couch surfing, I don't know if any of you have heard of that, a whole host of different ways of trying to get in touch with teachers in different countries and ask them, can I come and help out at your school? Oh, and can I come and stay with you as well, please? I didn't have that much money. And remarkably, they said yes. So I did. I went and taught in a number of schools. And so one option that was open to me at the time is I could have contacted local governments or policy institutions and said, I'm interested, please can you put me in touch with some schools? The reason I didn't do that is because I wasn't looking to go at the time to the best schools in the world. I didn't want to see, Singapore's finest school. I wanted to see Singapore in general, in as much as there's such a thing exists. I wanted to go to a few schools in each country to get a spread of what a normal school is like. And again, there is no such thing as a normal school, of course. But I suppose I mean not a school that was notable for a particular reason. So that's why I took this approach, going via teachers. It didn't always go that smoothly. So in one case, the school that I'd intended to visit in Shanghai had fallen through. So I'd already been to visit an experimental school in quite a wealthy area that was doing some interesting things. I'd been to visit a school for migrant children, so migrants to Shanghai, so children of migrant workers, typically quite poor. And I visited, then I taught there for a week. But I really wanted to go to a school in the suburbs, a kind of, typical school near where I was staying, near the teacher I was staying with. So I thought, well, I can just ask. There's no harm. This is clearly becoming my philosophy. There's no harm in asking. So I walked up to the school. I do not speak Mandarin, but I had 10 lessons before I went to China. I walked up to the school, and Chinese schools have guards outside them. You can see one in the picture here. And I said, 我是英国人，我是老师, which I think means probably poor grammar, but I'm English, I'm a teacher. And I also said something which means I look school, and I can't remember how to say that now in Mandarin. But so I said that, and this guard just stared at me incomprehensibly. And I just stood there and smiled at him until he picked up the phone and said what I can only imagine is something like, there's a strange English woman standing outside the school, please send someone down who speaks English. And they did. So a lady came down who spoke English, and I said, I'm really interested in what you're doing. Shanghai does so well in international tests. I'd love to come in and visit some lessons or speak to your teachers. And she said, yep, fine, give me your email address. I'll come back. You can come back tomorrow. So it worked amazingly. These are some of the lovely teachers that I stayed with. So through staying with teachers, just got a perspective from then day-to-day chats in the car, as well as more formal interviews, which were recorded as well. Interviewed young and old. So this is my youngest interviewee. he was telling me about the effects of Confucian culture on setting and streaming in Chinese schools. So that is what I did. And as Tim said, I didn't just then think, right, I'm going to write a book about what I saw. I went and read what everyone else, not everyone else, lots of other people. So really standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of trying to understand the evidence behind various different policies and practices on a global level. So what I hope you'll see today, because I'm going to try and do this in this talk, and what I have done in my book, is illustrate concepts or ideas or theories with my own experiences and anecdotes and conversations with people, but back that up with a wider body of research evidence, so it's not just, I saw this, therefore, this is how it is. So let's start with what is PISA, because ultimately I went to these countries because they performed well in PISA, and those countries being Finland, 2 provinces in Canada, Shanghai, which I know is not a country, but until recently entered separately from the rest of China, Japan and Singapore. And this slide I included before I saw the list of who was coming this evening, and I realised you're all assessment experts. So of course you'll know this already, and it's slightly intimidating. So here we go. So it's the Programme for International Student Assessment. It was designed in the 1990s by the OECD to measure students' performance at the end of compulsory schooling, so typically ages 15 to 16. And it tests the application of skills in reading, maths, and science. And I've highlighted application because what a lot of people who aren't familiar with PISA think is that you can just cram and then score highly. And that's why all these East Asian countries are doing well, is because they just swallow the textbook, rote learn it all, and we don't have anything to learn from them because that's not what we want for our students. You cannot do well in PISA through just learning facts alone. It does require an application of that knowledge. So here's an example. Example of a maths question, one of the PISA tests. I'll just give you a minute to have a look at that, see the kind of question it is. So you can see that in order to answer that question, I need to figure out what mathematical operations are required initially, conduct those mathematical operations, and then figure out what my answer refers to back in that real-world context. Of course, it's a pen and paper test or a computer-based test. It's not actually real-world, but it gets at some of what it is to use mathematics. Of course, I also acknowledge that there is more to education than PISA. That's another response sometimes I get. Well, we don't care about PISA because we want children to learn 21st century skills, and that's all going to be obsolete because we can just Google everything. Which I'm not going to go into that whole argument very much today. I assume that the audience here are with me on the fact that we can't just Google everything. But I will say that even if you think that there is more to education than the application of reading, maths and science, which of course I do, and I'm sure you all do, most people would also agree that this is at least an important part of what we want children to be able to do. We want all of them to be able to leave school with at least basic knowledge of mathematics and literacy to enable them to participate in 21st century life or would have been the same in 20th century, 19th century, etc. Right, so I'm going to go through quite a variety of topics today. So I'm not going to deep dive into anything. I'm going to give quite a big overview and hopefully tie some of those things together to give you an idea of what's going on in these countries. I want to start by addressing some stereotypes around pedagogy. So many people think, and this is partly, I think, based on media representations, that in Singapore, Japan, Shanghai, the style of pedagogy is the teacher stands at the front, writes on the board, gets children to memorize what's on the board and copy it down in their books. Equally, based on media stereotypes, you might think that in Finland, the teacher never does any talking at the front of the class. All the children are in groups, working on their own projects for weeks at a time. Oh, and there are no subjects. That's not true. None of that is true, and I do think the media should take a little bit more responsibility for accurately reporting what's going on in these countries. I want to give you a quote just to illustrate this let's start with Finland, from a girl called Emma. So when I met her, Emma was 15. And she was telling me, I said, well, just try and describe for me a typical lesson. You know, what happens in Finnish school? You walk into the classroom, what usually happens? She says, we'd come into class and be seated and go through the homework. If you hadn't done it, there'd be such anxiety because they'd call out random people for the answers. And if they picked you, you wouldn't know. Then they'd see if anyone had anything to say about it or anything to ask. Then we'd go through the next subject we were going to talk about, like, this is how it works and that's how it goes. And we'd make notes and ask questions and discuss, and then they'd give us some exercises to do from our workbooks, and that would be the rest of the lesson. The teacher would go to individual people if they had questions. But it depends on the subject. It was like that in maths, but in languages we'd have sets of work, like oral pair work and games. So you can see that from that description that it's certainly not the case that children are just doing extended student-centred type learning. And actually, so stats backing that up come from TALIS, so a big survey of teachers, and they were asked various different questions about how often they do certain practices. And one of those questions was asking them how often they report that children work in small groups to come up with a solution to a problem. And in Finland, 37% of teachers said that they do that every lesson or most lessons. In the UK, 58%. So English teachers are doing that much more than Finnish teachers are. And I should also mention at this stage that a lot of what Finland is doing now sounds very interesting, but cannot logically be the cause of their high results in PISA. Finland first came top in the world in PISA in the year 2000. So the really interesting stuff we should be looking at, therefore, is what they were doing in the 1990s and the 1980s. And there is an excellent paper on this by Mr. Oates himself and a man called Gabriel Salgren, which you should have a look at, called Real Finnish Lessons, which is very interesting on that. And then, so the East Asian stereotype was also challenged for me. So these are stereotypes that I held myself. And to be completely honest, sometimes it was true. So in Japanese high schools, there was quite a lot of teacher talk. Not to the extent that it was a whole lesson, but there might be 20 minutes of the teacher explaining something, first of all, at the beginning of the lesson. But I also saw so much really interactive, really active thinking going on in East Asian classrooms, more so, in fact, than anywhere else, in Singapore in particular. So to give you an example of one lesson, in a maths lesson, so the teacher would ask a fairly straightforward question and take answers from 3 different students, write their answers on the board, not saying if they were right or wrong. Then say, okay, so that you come up with this answer, tell me your strategy, how did you get there? Okay, that's interesting. What's another way? What do you think of that answer? How could we do it a different way? So really getting students to think about the strategies that they were using to achieve different answers, not simply saying, well, that's right, that's wrong, and memorize this, please. Now, I'd like to share a pedagogical snapshot with you. This is very interesting data, but it is quite limited, hence the snapshot. So this graph, I'm not sure how much you can see from where you are, but this graph is a mapping of student report of the kind of pedagogical practices going on in their classrooms across all of the different countries that take part in PISA. And the way that the question has worked is a number of questions the OECD have defined as being more traditional and teacher-directed instruction, and a number of questions they've defined as being more student-oriented instruction. So the kind of things you might expect. Teacher-directed, the teacher will set out at the beginning of the lesson what they want us to learn. The teacher will explain concepts. Student instruction is we work in groups to find out the answer to a question. For example, if you're interested in the full breakdown of these, it's the study is by Alfonso and colleagues, 2016, OECD published. So it's really interesting, the mapping here. So on the right, you'll see more teacher-directed instruction, so-called. On the left, more student-oriented instruction. And I'll talk about the y-axis in a moment. But what they've done here, what I've done here, is highlighted countries that do very well in PISA. And you will see, sorry, I haven't got a pointer with me, but the OECD average is just above the 3 on the x-axis. So you can see that with the exception of Switzerland, every top-performing country is further to the right, which means they are using more teacher-directed instruction than the OECD average. Yes, please. Just in case. Thanks. Oh, how clever. Snazzy. Perfect. Thanks, Tim. Oops. So yes, in case you didn't see that, OECD average is there, and you can see these yellow countries mainly being more teacher-directed instruction. In terms of what that looks like, because obviously that covers a whole host of different practices, teachers did, and there was more in common between the different countries than there was different, although obviously they were not the same. It was quite a lot of whole class teaching. So teachers would have a clear idea of what they wanted students to learn, would often start by either going over the homework or explaining a new concept to the children. They then engage them throughout that explanation, often with questions, encourage class discussion, do the kind of thing I was just talking about in Singapore, getting students to comment on each other's answers, and then do some kind of practice or activity using what they've just learnt and check for understanding. So that's... Yes, and then just something else. The OECD have also had a look at this kind of thing using teacher report rather than student report, and they found that students were less likely to succeed in both easy and difficult mathematics items if the teachers in their school reported more frequent use of student-oriented strategies. So it seems like student-oriented strategies are not particularly helpful when it comes to having knowledge and applying it. They may well be helpful for other things, but not so much for this. And then memorization and elaboration. So you know what memorization is. Elaboration, the kind of items that counted towards this were my teacher helps me make connections to other subjects, and thinking deeply about particular concepts. Now, this is much more balanced. You'll see they're all kind of spread around the middle, both things being important. Have a look at who's up here. So, we say, oh, we can't learn anything from Japan because they just memorize everything. We, in the United Kingdom, our students are reporting that they do much more memorizing than any country apart from Ireland, including all the East Asian countries. So that's a surprise. Now, I've called this a snapshot because this is, of course, when students have sat PISA, so when they're 15 to 16. So at age 15 to 16, these are the kind of strategies that students are using. English students, students from the UK, are memorizing more than even Chinese students, for example. But that's just when they're 15. If you have a look at what they're doing when they're 7, 8, and 9, it's actually quite a different picture. So in the earlier years, I'm not talking about early years being 3, 4, and 5, but ages 7, 8, and 9, Chinese students are doing a lot of memorization. They are learning all of their times tables, they're learning all of their number facts, they're learning their Chinese characters. There's a lot of that, and there's a lot of practice. There's a lot of what you might call drill, in that they're really practicing the basics, really getting to grips with those. But what it seems that this means is that when they're older, they're actually doing more kind of elaboration, let's connect ideas, rather than relying on memorizing the different steps to solve a particular problem. And I'm going to introduce you to a couple of people. Let me just get the right part. Oh, I don't know how to scroll down. No, I'll just find it in here, it's fine. Let's meet Sophie. Sophie and Roni. Okay, so when I was in Canada, I met 2 Chinese students who'd moved there a couple of years ago. Sophie had actually moved there when she was 15, so she went to school in Canada, but had experience learning in China. Roni had moved as an undergraduate and was now teaching students mathematics, preparing them for applications to college. So he had some very interesting theories about the differences between Chinese and Canadian students in terms of the kind of questions they had and the kind of skill level they were at on these maths papers. And there's a particular question in the entrance exams for American college, as they call it, which give you lots of facts about a number. They don't tell you what the number is. They say x is a prime number. I can't think of another thing now apart from x is divisible by, which obviously couldn't make sense, so I won't use that one. But they'll give you a number of facts, and then they'll say, what is the number? And Roney was saying that he has a mnemonic, a way of approaching this, which Canadian students really like, but Chinese students don't, called Zone F, which is, you can just think through the various different kinds of number. So is it 0? Is it a negative number, etc. And I want to tell you why he thinks that this is the case, that Canadian students like that and Chinese students don't. For the Asian teacher, before they help students onto that level, so that kind of more elaboration, they actually use a more systematic approach. You know, a massive amount is drills, exercises and homework to make students master things, to feel the intuitive side of it. But this comes from a massive amount of homework and practice. Whereas the typical Canadian student has so much less experience practicing with numbers that they're still on the stage of following the structure. And partly because they didn't have enough of the structure at school, they still appreciate how their tutor has this secret weapon of Zone F, so that they can solve the puzzle. So they're still on that stage. And then Sophie was in the same conversation. Where's Sophie gone? Yes, and she was complaining that when she came to Canada, she had to follow all the structured steps to come to an answer in her mathematics lessons, even though she could just see the answer and do it in one step. She had to go through all the steps anyway. So she said, they just require you to do it the way they taught you. They give you an example assessment question in class with some numbers plugged in, and then you have to use your calculator to find the answer. In the exam, it would be exactly the same question, except the numbers are changed. So as long as you memorize the right way to do it and plug in the numbers, you get it right. So here you have the Chinese accusing the Canadians of being dogmatic. Okay, different from usual. And I do think this helps explain as well why the United Kingdom is way up there. In there are 15-year-olds, because they haven't had enough practice of the basics and actually memorised those number facts and really got the intuitive side of maths, it means they're still having to memorise the steps rather than having a fluency of mathematical understanding. Right, I thought I ought to talk to you about assessment today. So just I suppose, a few thoughts on things that these different systems are doing in terms of assessment. So Shanghai, for a start, I think formative assessment is easier for Chinese teachers because Chinese teachers teach fewer, or at least teachers in Shanghai, teach fewer lessons per week than English teachers do. So typically they might teach 3 lessons a day. What that means is they have time in the day to mark the student work from that day so that the very next lesson they're able to present to the students, here are some things that you all didn't get right, let's go over some misconceptions. And there was one lesson in a Chinese school where I asked the teacher if I could visit her classroom, and she said, oh, it would be very interesting, we're just going over the homework. And I thought, what you don't think is very interesting is probably the reason that your children understand whatever subject it was, because you are identifying the misconceptions that children have in the homework and addressing those immediately. They're also, within a lesson, asking a lot of questions, like 50 to 120 questions a lesson, starting with some easy questions, getting harder, of the kind that I was explaining to you earlier. In Singapore, many of the teachers' guides contain hinge questions. So I suppose my point here is that you don't have to be an expert teacher already to use some really excellent questions in lessons, because it's provided for you. So not all schools have these, but some schools have teachers' guides where it will include a question which is really going to help you as a teacher understand where the students are, whether they've understood something or not, and then direct the lesson content appropriately. In Japan, similarly, they plan these through lesson study, and I'll talk a little bit more about lesson study later, but groups of teachers planning together. So it's not that before every lesson I need to really think through and come up with some amazing questions which are going to help me formatively assess the students. They are given to me, often by more experienced teachers. So Stevenson and Stigler, some researchers who did some research in Japan, a couple of decades back now, but they asked one teacher what they did in lesson study, because like, what do you talk about? And the teacher said, a great deal of time is spent talking about questions we can pose to the class. Which wordings work best to get students involved in thinking and discussing the material? One good question can keep a whole class going for a long time. A bad one produces little more than a simple answer. So again, you know, your stereotypes about Japan where it's right, wrong answers, memorize this, not actually correct. In Finland, students are encouraged to mark their own work. They put quite a lot of focus on self-assessment because they want the students to form a realistic image of their own development and understand what the teacher's looking for. And in Canada, even the tests that they have at the province, so these are standardized tests, are used in a formative way. So let me introduce you to some teachers from Canada. So these teachers are from Ontario, and they're talking about the EQAO, which is their standardized tests in primary school. It's more of a dipstick. I don't think anyone feels threatened by it anymore. If you had grade 3 when the EQAO came in, you died. But people know what it is. It took a while to get to this point, but people realise now that it's not something that reflects your practice. School principals don't hold individual teachers to account for their class results, as it's not one person's responsibility, right? The grade 6 results are the responsibility of teachers in grades 4, 5 and 6, so that's us as a collective, not each person as an individual teacher. Standardised testing is not our driver, but it is our driver in a way. We didn't do well in grade 6 this past year, and we wanted to know why. So we looked to see where the gaps were, for example, in fractions. What do we need to do as teachers to reduce those gaps? So they're taking even a kind of standardised test, and they are using it to see, right, where did our students have misconceptions, what should we be doing? And actually what also happens in Canada is superintendents will get involved in those kind of conversations and say, okay, so your students didn't do so well in this school in the district, they've got a really great way of addressing that, why don't you go and have a look? And they will link schools up with one another to learn from one another. Moving on to summative assessment proper, well, that was summative assessment but used formatively. This is probably the thing which differed the most between all of the countries I looked at. So to give you an example, in Finland, there is regular testing. So a lot of people, again, misconceptions think that in Finland they just don't test students. That's not true. The teachers give students fairly regular tests. What they don't have is a national universal examination. So there is no exam set by the state that every student takes. There is an examination at 18 that those who are still in school at 18 take, but at 15 to get into a selective college, it's actually a teacher-given grade. So the teachers will assess students continuously over the last 2 years of middle school and give a grade based on that. So China, there are very high-stakes tests, and this was actually quite sad to see in terms of how this affected students. So one of the teachers I stayed with had a 15-year-old daughter, and she would regularly do 3 or 4 hours of homework a night, and that was just the norm. And the parents don't like it, or some of them encourage it, but a lot of them said to me, well, we haven't really got a choice, because everyone else is doing this, so if our students didn't, they'd fall behind. And the nature of those high stakes, I think it partly comes from the system and it partly comes from the culture. So they're high stakes in the sense that at 15 it's to get into a selective high school, and at 18 it's to get into a selective university. So there is competition there. Not everyone can get into the most prestigious universities. But I think it's particularly high stakes in Shanghai because I think culturally, and I hope no one minds me making these generalizations, there is a very strong idea about what success is, and it's quite a narrow view. To be successful, you need to go to the best high school, go to the best university, do the most difficult course to get into, and that will line you up with a job in one of the best companies, and even get you the best spouse. I went for a walk in the park in Shanghai and came across a whole load of middle-aged people, not students, with paper with Chinese written on. As I said, I do not speak Chinese. I could not read Chinese apart from numbers. So I noticed some numbers and figured out later that it was a marriage market. So parents had come to basically advertise their children as prospective marriage partners to do arranged meetings. And some of the information on there was education, where you went to university, what course you did. So literally, that's the stakes for the student. I'm thinking, gosh, if I don't manage to get into university, I might not find a nice lady or a nice man. So there's that level of the narrowness of success. In Japan, there is quite a lot of pressure at age 15 in 9th grade, but that pressure is is a bit more delayed. There's no primary school leaving exam, so they don't have that level of pressure. But in Singapore, it happens even younger. So in Singapore, you have high-stakes exams at age 12, and high stakes is a loaded term, I know, but I mean it. They are high stakes. If you don't do well in your PSLE, or primary school leaving exam, then you don't get into a good secondary school. That limits what courses you're allowed to take. So you do badly in your primary school leaving exam, you can't even take GCSEs. So then it's very difficult. It's not impossible, because you can move if you do very, very well, but it's quite unlikely that you'd ever be able to take A-levels, which denies you certain opportunities later on. And parents know this. So parents put a lot of pressure on children to do well in these tests, as you would. And there's a lot of private tutoring that goes on to get students ready for those tests. As a result, those tests actually get harder and harder, because children are learning more and more. So this is from Mouths of Babes. This is from a blog. What's it called? It's by a lady called Petunia. Sorry, I really ought to quote her properly. But she writes a lot about education, and she's got a son who, in her blog, she calls Little Boy. And this is a recorded conversation between Little Boy and his mum. And they're talking about the exams being difficult. So this is PSLE, so he's 12. Mum, this happens, since the exams are hard, because as different groups of students go through the education system, children become better and better. Therefore, this forces the government to raise the standards of the PSLE. Mum. Yes, but where will it end? Maybe in 10 years' time, PSLE students will need to do research in order to get into a good secondary school. Little Boy. That won't happen, Mum. It's just like a bubble, you know. It'll burst one day. Mum. Eh? Son. Okay. The government will raise the standards of the PSLE. The PSLE bubble of skills and knowledge will get bigger and bigger and bigger. Then, when the students cannot take it anymore, they will all commit suicide. Then the PSLE bubble of skills and knowledge will pop and become smaller because the government will be forced to bring down standards, otherwise there will be no more children left. We will all have died. So as long as you help me get through this, it will be okay. We can do it, Mum. And don't worry about your grandson, because I think when that time comes, the bubble will have burst. Mum. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. So, Little Boy is probably be okay because his mum is an expert in child psychology and aware of these things and how stress affects children. Many children don't have parents like that. They may have parents who understandably put pressure on children because it does affect their lives. So you can probably tell from the way I'm saying this that I disapprove of having such high stakes for children at such a young age. And Singapore, of all of the countries that I went to, is the only one that does this at that age. I think Canada strikes a good balance in terms of external, provincial or national assessment. So they have a balance. So they have some subjects are examined through provincial level tests, standardised tests. So you might have 3 in year 10, 4 in year 11, 4 in year 12 equivalent. And the other subjects are assessed through teacher-given grades over the course of the whole course. So for university entrance, that's what they will look at. They will look at that combination. In primary school and in secondary school, what the Canadians are doing, and certainly this is the case in Ontario and British Columbia, is they have certain standards that they expect all children to reach per year. So they will have standards for year 8, they would expect in maths children to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And the way that those children are assessed and that assessment is reported by the teachers is not yet at expectations, fully at expectations, or exceeding expectations. The reason that I point that out is because that is different from what we did here until quite recently. So they say, right, this is how we want you to get in year 8. We used to say, okay, you're a level 3. You should be a bit higher than that by now, but you're in level 3, so the next step for you is let's try and get you to, a 3A, and then a level 4. And, that might happen for you in year 9 or year 10. It's quite a different approach to saying everyone's going to get here in year 8, and if you're not there, rather than saying, oh, okay, well, maybe next year, they are giving them extra support to get them up there. And I'd like, at this point, to introduce you to Bart Simpson. So, Bart is actually very wise. So my question for you is, what do Chinese teachers and Bart Simpson have in common? I won't actually get you to answer it. Funny haircuts. None of the Chinese teachers I saw had hair quite like that. So I spoke to 2 Chinese teachers who had been abroad to teach. One had been to England on the maths exchange program that's happened quite recently. One had been to America and taught there for a year. And so I obviously asked them, so what do you think of the differences, you know, strengths, weaknesses, pros, cons? And they said lots of lovely stuff about both England and America. And it's absolutely true. There was a lot of fantastic practice going on in English schools, and I do want to kind of emphasize that, because the very nature of what I talk about means that I sound very negative about England, and there is some wonderful, wonderful practice going on. I think it's just in pockets. Some schools are absolutely phenomenal, others are fairly dire. But I did push them, and I said, okay, well, is there anything that you thought was less good in these countries? And both of these were 2 different conversations, and both of them seemed to be a bit uncomfortable and said the same thing. One thing I found strange, though, is that some students were given easier work. How are they supposed to keep up with their friends if they do easier work? They were really confused. Bart Simpson says something similar. So there's one episode in which Bart is put in a remedial class, and he says, let me get this straight. We're behind the rest of our class, and we're going to catch up to them by going slower than they are. Cuckoo, cuckoo. Now, that actually is very logical, isn't it? And I hadn't ever considered this question or thought this way until I went out and spoke to those Chinese teachers. But it does seem strange. If we want students to do well, why would we give them easier work? Now, bear with me, because I'm going to talk a little bit about differentiation now. But first of all, I wanted to share with you the kind of macro picture. So 5 of the 6, I also went to New Zealand. I shamefully admit New Zealand because I didn't write about New Zealand, and New Zealand crashed in PISA since I went there. I can talk about that if anyone's interested in why that is later. I just didn't really think it was fair to put those theories in a book and publish it. So all 5 of 6 systems I visited, students are not tracked into different schools until age 15 or 16. So Singapore being the exception, as I mentioned. And actually, of 12 top performing systems in 2012, 10 of those are not tracking until 15 or 16. The OECD average is 14. So they're all leaving it later to put students into different schools based on ability. Of those countries, they are also not selected into different classes by ability until 15 or 16. So they're not setting or streaming either. Again, coming from England, from a secondary school in England, that was fairly mind-blowing for me, because I've only ever taught in a school where there was setting for almost all subjects. And even within a classroom, first of all, it shouldn't be that surprising, because if you look at the research on setting and streaming, this is taken from the Educational Endowment Foundation toolkit, where they look at all the research on an area and summarise its impact. Summarise the impact of the intervention. Setting on streaming, they find that it has negative impact, but it is very cheap. So maybe that's why lots of English schools still do it. Based on moderate evidence, so the locks indicate how strong that evidence is. Even within lessons, in these countries, there's not actually that much differentiation by activity. And this is self-report from teachers, tell us again. So England, 63% of teachers are saying, I differentiate by giving different activities to different students. Every lesson or most lessons, 63%. Certainly when I was teaching, it was very much encouraged. If you were trying to do like an Ofsted outstanding lesson, you had to have mild, medium and spicy worksheets. So it's very much encouraged here. The average internationally is 44%, but Finland, Japan, Singapore, Korea, Netherlands are doing it much less. So that's interesting. So how on earth does that work? Because mixed ability teaching, or correction of myself, mixed attainment teaching, let's not be assuming that ability is necessarily measured by the test that they take at the end of primary. Mixed attainment teaching is really hard. It's difficult. If there's a big gap in terms of where students are at, it's quite difficult to teach. But yet these countries are managing to do it and managing to have far more of their students than we do getting at least those basic levels of literacy and numeracy by the time they leave school. So it's not simple. It's not that they're not differentiating. They are differentiating, but that differentiation is by support rather than activity. So rather than giving them easier work, they might give them like some extra support, more scaffolding, but the intention is always for them to have ultimately the same outcomes as is stated in the national or the provincial expectations. Now, there are a number of ways in which they make this work. And I think the difference here, so of course, we talk about high expectations in England all the time. Certainly when I did my teacher training, it was all about high expectations. But I realised that actually I didn't have high expectations of the students I taught when I was teaching. I had high hopes. I really hoped they would all get at least a C. But I didn't truly expect or take the behaviours. You know, I taught as best I could. But there's an assumption here that, well, they need to meet these standards. So we will design our system so that they meet these standards. We won't hope that they are going to get a C and then put them in the bottom set and say, oh, well, you came in on a level 3, so you're only really going to get whatever it is. I've been out of the English classroom in that system for a couple of years now. They have those same high expectations. So yes, some children are going to need more support to get there, but the intention is that they will still get there. So here are some things that they do to make that work. How do they make that work? So I'm going to talk through a few. Ooh, that's not in the right order. So firstly, they have excellent teachers. They have well-trained teachers who plan together to ensure that each concept is taught clearly the first time, looking at research often in terms of what is the best way to explain this particular concept, and then explaining it in different ways until all students understand. They employ or make time for additional teacher support for those who still don't understand or fall behind. They design curriculum for mastery, and I'm running through these. I'm going to come to each of these in turn in a moment, to ensure that all understand before moving on. And crucially, they believe that it's possible. They believe that all children can achieve. So let's start with the first one, so teacher collaboration. I won't talk about teacher training now, but if anyone would like to talk about that, feel free to ask during the questions. So once your teachers are in schools, in Finland and East Asia, there was at least weekly timetabled planning of lessons for all teachers of a subject or in the same year group. That certainly didn't happen for me when I was teaching. Perhaps some schools in England do it. But this is quite a save in terms of workload. Rather than having to plan all of your lessons, you co-plan with other teachers. There's an opportunity to learn from more experienced teachers, and you're not having to plan all the lessons. You might plan a particular activity, and another teacher might make a worksheet if that is the approach that they're going to take. They have lesson study, which I touched on earlier. So on a couple of occasions, I walked into classrooms in Shanghai and also Japan, and you'd have 10 teachers at the back of the room with clipboards. It happened to me because I was obviously teaching as well, so I'd have lots of teachers come and watch me, and you've got lots of teachers and possibly a video camera at the back of the room. It seems quite intimidating. But it's not. Having spoken to them, it's not intimidating for them in the way that it would be intimidating were this happening in a school in southwest London where I taught. Because they are not judging the teacher, they're judging the lesson. And that's the key difference. So what they're doing when they come, they plan it together for a start. So they're jointly planning this lesson, and then they are in the classroom and watching the students. They're writing down what the students say. They're having a look, oh, where did the students get stuck? Where was there a misconception? And then they come back together and they discuss, okay, what can we change about this lesson plan so that the students don't have that misconception next time we teach it? So you can see how you will then have a bank of lessons which have been tried and tested and adapted for teachers to use and adapt as they see fit based on the particular students that they teach. Again, massive reduction in workload for those teachers. And then finally, I mean, different ways of doing this in different countries, but all of them had professional learning communities of one sort or another. And these kind of steps to an effective professional learning community are taken from a couple of sources. One's called Beyond PD from a group of researchers in New Zealand, and one's from Dylan William. The references are at the bottom there. You can see on the right, I'm not going to talk through all of them, but 3 different approaches from 3 of the countries I went to professional learning communities. But essentially, they are based on an analysis of student learning or an identification of a problem. So either what have the students done poorly in a test, or what particular problems am I having in the classroom, what do I want to solve? They will often, not always, but include a focus on subject-specific expertise. So this is not just about classroom management, this is about how do we teach gravity? What are the common misconceptions when you're teaching gravity? They're sustained over time, they're collaborative, and they happen approximately every 4 weeks. Dylan William has found at least 75 minutes with 8 to 12 participants is ideal. And just one other thing that I wanted to say before I move on is that this kind of professional collaboration is not only helpful in terms of workload and helpful in terms of improving teaching. It's good for teacher well-being. And there was a study done by Professor Liana in New York City on what she called social capital. And she looked at, she asked teachers to fill in a questionnaire saying how many times did they talk to their colleagues about teaching, and what kind of relationship did they have in terms of warmth with those colleagues. And she did find that in those schools that had kind of healthy professional learning communities, just in the sense of having good connections with colleagues, the students did significantly better than in countries, in schools where they didn't. So social capital really makes a difference, and connecting teachers with each other has a whole host of positive benefits. Additional support. This is Julius. So Julius is Finnish. And he is a special teacher. So what that means is that in Finnish schools, you don't only have class teachers, history teachers, or class teachers in primary, you have special teachers who work with those students who are stuck. Think teaching assistant, but with a degree and an additional master's in special needs. They're working as a teaching assistant. And that is the case in Finland and Canada, so they will employ additional teachers to work with students who are falling behind. That's how they can do these mixed attainment classes. The teacher themselves does a lot in the first place, and certainly in Finland, some of the teachers were complaining that they can't just get Julius in. They have to kind of write down what they've already tried to bring these students up to keep up with the class. But they use them as different groups each time. You know, sometimes it's the same children, but it's not right. You guys, you're the slow ones. You're going to be in a different room always with this teacher. It's dependent on the subject. It's dependent on the content. They might have misunderstood a particular thing, so they're going to go out. And also, it's not only children who are falling behind. It's those who are actually ahead of the class. It's those who need a bit of stretch, a bit of challenge. Julius will occasionally take those children out as well and do extension activities with them. So there's less of a stigma attached. Japan, Shanghai, and Singapore have touched on this already. It's also expert teachers who are supporting those weaker students, but this time it's the class teachers themselves, because as I said, they're teaching fewer lessons, they have more time, they can do that in between lessons or during independent study lessons. So in these East Asian countries, in the afternoons, they'll often have a session in school where the students are getting on with independent work, which means teachers can come in and have a quiet word with any students if they need to on a one-to-one basis. And then parental or tutor support where necessary. How am I doing for time?
Another 10, 15 minutes.
Perfect, perfect. Oh, and there's a cheaper version, because this sounds really expensive, doesn't it? Yes. Cheaper version, perhaps slightly less effective, but I think still an excellent idea, is peer tutoring. So in Canada, they do this consciously, deliberately. They will take students, older students, so either year 6 in primary or sixth form level in secondary, and they can sign up for a peer tutoring program. It counts often for credits. They will have a little bit of training in how do you best support students to learn, and then they will meet with younger students at lunchtimes or after school and actually support them in their learning. It's free. And accidentally, less planned, but this also happens within. If you have a mixed attainment class, the way the teachers use it, it can happen within a class. And I would like to introduce you to Ilpo, who is awesome, bit of a character from Finland, who's a local district policy person. So I was asking, I was actually asking Ilpo about the higher retainers, and this is his, I think, typically Finnish response. He says, the brightest kids, they'll learn anyway. Whatever you do with them, they're not the ones that need the help. I think when you're very talented, I mean, this is realism. There are more talented and less talented people. That's just the way of life. We're different, luckily. When you're more talented, you learn whatever you do. If you stand on your head, that's not a problem. But in the same time, you learn different things when you have to support someone who hasn't got that kind of talent. And if you're in the same group, sooner or later, you're in that situation where you say, well, don't you see? It works like this and this. And then you have a different level of learning inside your head. In that sense, you learn more and differently. And the less talented student also learns, the basic things at least. So anyone that's been a teacher will know that you don't really know something till you've had to explain it to someone else. Thanks for the murmur of support. Which leads me neatly on to mastery curricula and approach, because he's talking about the weaker students learning the basic things at least, and this is absolutely what the approach is with mastery curricula. So what we will sometimes, / a lot of the time, do in England, and I know they do in America as well, is there's quite a lot in the national curriculum or the school curriculum, and so you having to rush through, and certainly I found this, I had a moment that made me want to go and see if there are other ways, where I taught science. There was quite a chunky science curriculum to get through. I was told when I arrived that they hadn't actually finished the previous module, so I had to do that as well with the year 11s. And so I was just doing content, rushing on to the next thing. And I had one student who was not that engaged usually, put up his hand and said, "Miss, why do we sneeze?" Which is completely irrelevant to the topics I was teaching. But I just said, I haven't got time for that. And it's not in a curriculum, it's not in the exam, and I moved on. And that's such a shame, because wouldn't it be wonderful to have the time and the space? I mean, ideally, slightly more related to what I was teaching. But to go into, to answer those questions, to not completely go way off topic, but to bring children in by answering those questions. And I didn't have time. There was too much to cover. So mastery curricula, so in the East Asian countries I visited, they teach fewer topics, particularly in the earlier years, but it's in greater depth. So they will not move on to the next topic until everyone has understood the current topic. They'll get lots and lots of practice with each thing. So those who get it more quickly can go into more depth. They can actually be applying that learning. Those who struggle have the time to really understand it before the whole class moves on. So the vast majority of pupils are progressing through the curriculum at the same pace. If you fully understand something the first time, it means that when you next come back to it, a little recap should be enough because you've understood it the first time, and then you can build on it with the next topic. I have said that. Brilliant. And in terms of effectiveness of this in different contexts, there has been some research from John Jerrim at the IOE on this, and they've looked into where schools in England have been applying this Singaporean maths no problem, I think it's called, approach, which is mastery learning, and they have found that it is more effective than a control group who were doing a normal mathematics. Say normal, I really ought to know what the control group was, I apologise. It's shocking of me. Something else, they weren't doing this. And the EEF have also had a look at it, and they found that on average children make another 5 months progress taking this mastery learning approach. And it's also very cheap. So finally, all of this is important in terms of supporting all children to reach those high goals, but if you don't believe that it's possible for all children to meet those high goals, you can say, sure, I believe that all children can achieve, I've got high expectations, but you're not really going to put in the effort to explain it in a different way if you think fundamentally, it's just not going to work for you. Don't worry about it. Not everyone can be good at maths. It's okay, you're good at football. That's fine. You need to believe that it's possible, and the children need to believe that it's possible. And obviously teachers believing it and children believing it are going to be related based on how the teachers talk. But not only do you need to believe it, you need to want to learn as well. You need to think it's actually valuable to learn whatever it is that you're learning. And I was reading a book this morning called What Does This Look Like in the Classroom, which I recommend. And I just wrote down a quote from Dylan William, because he was talking about feedback. I thought this was quite relevant, and I'm a big fan. He says, ideally, owning feedback would come from the students seeking feedback. The problem in all this is that many teachers are giving their students feedback on things that the students don't really want to get better at, or think that they can't get better at, and that's why the feedback is so unwelcome. You know, I have a growth mindset. I believe that if I put my mind to something, I can achieve it, but I still can't speak French. And actually, there's a poor example, because I do actually want to speak French, so there's more to it than wanting it as well. There's also a matter of time and correct teaching. But, you know, you got to want it. So back to the countries that I'm supposed to be talking about. In Confucian culture, so Confucius being ancient Chinese philosopher and statesman who's very influential in China and Japan and Singapore, learning is a virtue, and everyone can do it. So I was speaking again to Roni, remember the Chinese guy who lives in Canada with the Zone F strategy? So I was talking to Roni about this. About something else. I was talking to him about moral education. And I said, what does it mean to be a good kid in China? What does it mean to be moral? And he said, working hard for sure. So for him, actually part of being a good person is being studious and working hard, because learning is really privileged. Self-perfection is a goal that everyone should be aiming for. And this is conveyed to children through, I don't know whether they talk to them about Confucius explicitly, but through stories like this chap, Quang Heng. So this is a story told to me by another Chinese student I met this time in Shanghai. And she was telling me that Quang Heng's her favorite. He's a famous scholar, very accomplished. When he was a child, he got a bit upset because he wasn't able to study in the evening because his family couldn't afford oil for the lamp. So it's a wasted study opportunity. So he made a hole in the wall of his house. So I'm not quite sure about the moral element of that. But he made a hole in the wall of his house so to let through light from his richer neighbours so that he could continue studying into the evening. So through these kinds of stories, children are really given the sense that it's a really good thing. We're going to, be really pleased with you if you work hard. And that's reflected as well in how they use praise. So it is not like this. This is a genuine stamp from off the internet. You can buy personalised stamps. Mr. William thinks I'm smart. Research, so I imagine that many of you will be familiar with the work of Carol Dweck, and I've deliberately not talked about growth mindset here because it's a massive topic and there are all sorts of nuances. But one great thing about her research is what she's done looking at praise and how you praise children and the kind of mindsets that generates. And she has suggested that telling children that they're smart, praising them for outcomes, is not particularly helpful because then they're not incentivized to try difficult things because otherwise they might fail and then it'll show that they're not smart. So much better to praise the efforts and the strategies they put in. And that is what they're doing. Before Carol Dweck existed, that's what they're doing in Japan and in Shanghai. They get children to stand up at the end of the week for applause. It's the child who's worked the hardest, not the one that's done the best. So they're really giving that impression that that is really what they want. And just, I suppose, wanted to finish by also saying that sometimes, you'll have heard of tiger mothers, no doubt. Sometimes getting children to these high standards means that the children are going to have work when they're not particularly interested in it. And the teachers will say, well, you've got to do it anyway. And actually, what famous tiger mother herself says in Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, Amy Chua, is that children not necessarily going to find something enjoyable to start with, but once they've practiced it and they get good at it, then it starts being fun because they get that attention, they get the praise, they're doing praise, I just said it was for the effort, but they're putting in the effort, they're enjoying playing the piano, they're enjoying doing the maths because they've got to grips with it. And I just wanted to contrast that with an alternative approach, which picked up occasionally in Canada, I'm not saying all Canadians are like this, but an idea that the most important thing actually is that children just pursue whatever they're interested in. And if they're interested in cats, their project should be on cats, not Shakespeare. I'm exaggerating. But I think that the East Asians perhaps have got it right in this respect, that we need to expose children to all sorts of things that they might love, that they might be interested in, but they just don't know about yet. So I want to finish with a little picture of the alternative. It says, by the 5th year, Jim really regretted following his childhood passion for ice cream. This is not what we want for our children. I hope today that I've given you some ideas, or at least generated some kind of more thinking about perhaps what we do want for our children. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy. I mean, really, again, a lovely journey through the journey that you made. I will say a couple of things, a couple of references. If you're interested in suicide rates amongst 16 to 19-year-olds, because this just comes up in lecture after lecture. And I had a very esteemed academic say in response to analysis of mastery methods in respect to mathematics, so you want to kill a lot of our young people. Okay, a very esteemed academic, by using these approaches in Singapore and Japan, because Japan and Singapore are so concerned about youth suicide. Yeah, the trouble is that which countries are above Japan in the suicide tables? I mean, of Colver's research, Cash and Bridges' research, and Wasserman, Cheng and Yang's research. Above Japan are USA. Above that is New Zealand is dreadful. Finland is above that. And Lithuania is second. Okay? So, I mean, it just blows all, the common discourse which we see in the press. I mean, I agree absolutely. The press have to stop perpetuating these stereotypes. They pick them up. Stigler and Stevenson that you referred to, are brilliant on this. They did a lot of really, really detailed lesson observation, and Jim Stigler got really involved in observing Japanese stuff. I mean, you cited in your book, actually, the impossible maths problem. Fantastic bit of work. I mean, he just had an idea. He really immersed himself in Japanese educational culture. And he gave some North American kids an impossible maths problem. And he'd already analysed the notions of ability which were present amongst the North American kids. There were kids who were good at maths, and there were kids who were bad at maths. That was the discourse in the young people. So he gave them this impossible maths problem. And the mean time at which these kids abandoned this impossible maths problem were about 7 minutes. Okay, and when interviewed, they said, well, yeah, this is obviously a problem that I can't do because my ability is not of sufficiently developed to tackle it. What he found in the Japanese students is that they continued to try to do it even after he told them that it was an impossible problem. Okay, because they just thought with more effort it could be solved. And more discussion amongst themselves. They did it collaboratively. That was the other thing. The slightly unethical and humorous coda to it is that they then carried on doing it. And he came back to them months after, and they were still trying to do it.
Way behind with everything else.
Well, actually, of course, not so. And that kind of work that Lucy's referred to, on this emphasis in effort, is not on this conceptualization of effort amongst youth conceptualizations of their own learning, is not trivial at all. It runs unbelievably deeply through both the educational models and runs through the attainment profiles that we see. Better equity, better overall attainment, often at a very precocious level compared with many European countries. Okay, having given Lucy a bit of a breather, questions to Lucy, please. I'll take them one at a time, I think, because we have some time. So Simon Payton.
Lucy, I really like the idea that as a qualified teacher, then go and sit in a lot of other classrooms around the world and learn from them. That's something that few other teachers in Britain will be able to do. If you were a school governor, as maybe you are, and maybe many of the people in this room are, what one or two things would you want your school to do differently? I'm for a typical British school, which you also know pretty well. What are the sort of number one and two things? Based on all that you've learned.
This is what we always get asked. What one thing would you do?
Oh, I don't know, but right, give me 10. I'm very happy with 10.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make it a little bit...
Sure.
You can choose.
So I think quite a few of these things are completely achievable at a school level. You know, a lot of it is, especially in England, schools have so much autonomy that you can do tons of this stuff in schools, certainly as a governor. So a couple of things that I've mentioned, but I would, it's perhaps a little bit expensive, but give every teacher a period to collaborate and plan with colleagues of the same subject or lesson. I would, depending on where the school is and how big the gaps were, suggest that setting was ended or eliminated or made much more fluid. Because of course these countries, the gap doesn't get as big because they're doing all this stuff all the way through. So, you know, by the time you get to year 9, in England, the gap can be enormous. I would change the timetabling so that rather than teaching 6 different grades, so when my first year of teaching, I was teaching year 7, year 9, year 10, year 11, year 12 and year 13. I wasn't teaching, I was teaching 80% timetable, so I wasn't teaching that many lessons, but every single one I had to plan from scratch because they were all different and because there wasn't a bank of lesson plans. So I would change the timetable so that each teacher specialised in a particular couple of classes, depending on what subject. If it's maths, you can just 2 classes and teach like all of the year 7s, 2 years, all of the year 7s and all the year 8s. Become a specialist in that thing. Also reduces workload because you only have to plan a lesson once for all year 7s, particularly if you've gone towards a mixed attainment model, which I think you should. I would train up teaching assistants as a real priority. I don't think it's necessarily financially achievable to hire additional support teachers, but I would essentially give teacher training to teaching assistants and make sure that they were supporting the kids in a way that's getting them to learn more, rather than some teaching assistants, this is certainly not all of them, but will effectively wait enough time. If the student waits enough time, they'll just tell them the answer or do the work for them, and so it discourages student effort. I'll stop there. Is that enough?
That's great.
So,
Yeah, thank you.
And Simon, the thing about one thing or 2 things, I mean, we've recently published on international comparisons and emphasised the importance of the alignment of all of the factors which Lucy's actually talked about. So there's this issue of you know, what one thing, which is what journalists always ask, or what 2 things should I do or fund if I'm a politician? The answer is you really have to look at system alignment. And the reason for this is that we have very good selective systems around the world and we have very good non-selective systems around the world. But those systems are characterised, despite their different forms, the high-performing ones are those that possess, in Bill Schmidt's sense, curriculum coherence, alignment across all the factors.
And just, if I can, after that, give just one thing. Just one thing that's on my mind a lot that I think is terrible practice is student target grades. Student target grades, I think, are damaging. There's no evidence that they help in any way, and they just reinforce a fixed mindset idea that this is all you're capable of achieving if you try hard, but in both the teachers' minds and the students' minds. So I'd get rid of target grades. Thank you.
Okay. Loads of questions. So we'll go there, and there. Thanks very much indeed, Jenny. Can you say who you are and where you're from?
Ben Knight, Cambridge University Press. One thing you haven't mentioned is class size. And one of the arguments I've heard put forward is that one of the ways that some of these Asian countries create the economic space to train their teachers, provide support, is by having larger numbers of students. Is that something you've observed?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So the East Asian countries in particular do have larger class sizes. Finland is about the same as class sizes as here. Canada is smaller. But yeah, they prioritise having higher quality, higher paid teachers with bigger classes. There's no evidence that smaller class size helps. I mean, of course it doesn't. By itself, you have to actually change your teaching practice. And often teaching practice doesn't change, it just gets more expensive because there are few students in the class. And they can, the reason they can get away with large class sizes, and I make this point if I'm speaking to educators from developing countries where they haven't got the choice to have small class sizes, is that there is a lot you can do with a large class in terms of having this whole class teaching. If you know some of it is leading from the front and getting class discussion and using formative assessment techniques and whiteboards or whatever, you can actually do some very effective teaching with a lot of students in the class. And marking wise, like yes, it's a lot. In Shanghai, I'm not saying this is a great thing, but I did on at least 2 occasions catch students marking who just having a lesson off to mark all of their peers' work. Like they were given the mark scheme and they were marking a whole class set, so that teachers weren't doing it. In Japan, students are supposed to mark their own homework before they even come back into school. The answers are in the back of the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Right, and then there, and then we'll come here.
Thank you. So Mark Neeson from Cambridge International, but also a local primary governor in Cambridge as well. So I was looking out for the word culture. I don't think you mentioned it once, actually. I was keeping an ear out for it. I think it's interesting because I think a school does operate in a culture, whether that's a local culture, a national culture, even a school culture itself. I would probably define it more as cultural expectations of education rather than a broader culture. But also schools are a lens for that, so schools have to represent the culture they live in. There are different schools and they all have different cultures. Was there a difference on your travels between primary and secondary cultures? Because that's sometimes anecdotally talked about. And how does that affect the learner progression across the system? Because when we talk about the system, it's a continuous system. So what was your perception on the way different schools approached in primary and secondary?
Yeah, great question. So probably the biggest distinction between primary and secondary in terms of cultures was within Japan. So Japanese middle school looks kind of like you would expect Japanese middle school to look like, in that students are pretty well behaved, sitting there in the classroom, they're listening to the teacher, they're doing group work when they're told to do group work, marching in time, no exaggeration. In primary schools, it was quite a shock because it's so noisy. And you, on one occasion, it's on the top floor and looking for a class, and then I heard them coming, this loud noise coming around the corner, children running back to their classroom, followed by the teacher running back to the classroom, what looks like very bad behaviour. And a lot of the assistant language teachers I spoke to, English and Americans who were working in primary school, said, yeah, it's quite challenging context. The thinking behind that, from the Japanese perspective, and I'm not saying that I'm advocating this, it's just different, it's really interesting, is that they think that children need to learn how to be part of society of their own choosing. So in the early years of school, they spend quite a lot of time on the socialisation bit before they start teaching the academic bit. And children learn in groups called Han, so Han is like a group of 4 children. And the teacher doesn't say, you must sit there, you must do the work. The child can go and wander off and play if they want, but the Japanese believe that they will see the value in other people and socialising. And if everyone else in the class is getting on with this, eventually they'll get bored and they'll come and choose to take part. So the teacher will often praise a Han rather than an individual student, or criticise a Han. So they might say, oh, Blue Han's done really well over here, but Yellow Han isn't ready yet because one of their kids is gone AWOL. And the rest of the kids in that group will be like, hey, come on, we need to get the praise from the teacher. So gradually the idea is that the children will choose to become part of that learning community. It's very strict at middle school, so I think it is quite a shock to some children when they then get to middle school. So this is a very different culture there. But universally, so that's Japan, which is an interesting case. Across all the countries all countries? Less so Canada, perhaps. But they start school at a later age than we do here. So even in Canada's at 6, Finland at 7, Shanghai at 7, Singapore at 6. And in kindergarten and in at least the first few weeks of school, they spend a lot of time getting that culture right. They spend a lot of time understanding the values of the school, practicing the transitions. They don't go straight into, let's learn stuff. So that's how they develop that culture.
Okay, thank you. There's a question there and then down here. Thank you. And can you say who you are? That'd be great.
So, Russell Whitehead, LT123. Why do we sneeze?
Now, this is a sad answer, I'm afraid. There is such a shortage of science teachers in this country due to, I think, teaching conditions more than pay, that they get people who do not have science degrees to teach science. I'm one of those people. I don't know. Irritation, I think, in the nose.
Yeah.
That's another reason why I didn't answer the question.
And here, thank you.
Yes, Rosemary Frost, I teach in an independent girls' school. You touched on it at the end, which was about culture, and we talk a lot about what we should do in schools, perhaps change. But I do feel, and I wonder what you think, that it's about how much education is valued. Mm-hmm. And I do think an issue in the UK is that education really isn't valued very much, whereas in these other countries it's clearly valued highly. And I do think that influences a lot of what happens in schools and the attitude of the students. And I just wondered what you thought.
I agree, yes.
Should we look at that then, as much as at our schools?
Look at that in what sense?
And try and instill in our country an idea that education is valuable. And so, for example, don't close it as soon as you have an election. Close a school. It's that sort of... and then the attitude of youngsters, it's why is education important for me? I don't need it.
So OECD have analysed parental commitment, haven't they?
Yes.
Across all the participating
So
countries.
I mean, definitely there are differences in that. I mean, I think... So yes, there are small things, I mean, things that you can do to make it seem that way to children. So like just again, Japan being very different, they have an entrance ceremony to school at every stage of school, and they invite all the local dignitaries who come and make speeches about how exciting it is that these children are starting or these children are graduating. So small things like that. I think also we need to look outside of education, because children will think that education is important if they see peers or other people succeeding because of education. And there's a report out recently suggesting that actually social mobility is not so much to do with education as to do with access to the labour market. And forgive me, I can't give the details of the study, but essentially it was saying that even if in a school in a more challenging area from a certain social background, even if you get the grades, doesn't mean you'll actually go on to be particularly successful in your career. So I think, as a society, there are some issues which are much harder to address.
Yeah. I mean, one of the key things that Lucy and I have been discussing is the issue of what does curriculum theory now describe? And the answer is that elaborated curriculum theory now includes the relationship between the home environment and the school, not least in respect of the amount of exchange of formal work between the primary school and secondary school and the home. I mean, Jane Mellenby's in the audience and has done a lot of work on the acquisition of complex language by young children. And that's strongly influenced by the linguistic exposure within the home. I mean, David Blunkett, of course, did confront this, and he said, no longer should we use the excuse of low social economic status to justify low attainment in schools. I mean, it is, and I think it was right to say that, albeit crude. Many schools in very deprived circumstances have systematically tackled that, not least by having means of reaching down into the community to help and communicate to the parents what the expectations might be in those families in terms of supporting children in learning, and had some very, very positive results. I mean, in Portsmouth, for example, in very deprived areas, the aspirations of these parents, often 2 generations unemployed, escalated enormously when the schools began to make clear the kind of expectations that they would have in terms of the amount of learning going on in the home. So I don't think it's a counsel of despair at all. You didn't mention tutoring, and this is another myth, by the way, that knocks around, that the explanation of all of the attainment, the high attainment, high equity in Southeast Asian area can be explained through high levels of tutoring. There is a real problem with this, because the tutoring is of enormous variability in quality. Okay, and it tends to be the best tutoring, and in Singapore the tutors are on billboards, flashing billboards, as you drive down the streets with their names, and they are highly sought after by the most wealthy families. Hang on a minute. A form of educational provision, informal, not regulated by the state, where the very good ones are accessed by the wealthiest families. Hang on, that should increase disparities in the education system, not decrease them. But in Singapore, we have high attainment and low spread. So tutoring is not the sole explanation for a high level of attainment. It may well be a symptom of a high societal commitment to education amongst all families, that you purchase it. And in fact, many of the schools say, we're really annoyed about the tutors because they do things which contradict what we're doing in school, which is very confusing for the kids. Yeah. So, again, we have, I think, curriculum theory, and I'm looking, Martin's left now, but Martin and I were just discussing this in terms of the approach that we take in Cambridge. Curriculum theory expands to accommodate what occurs in the home and the attitudes and the learning processes there. Right, loads more questions now. So we've got... you've got the microphone, good. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, there.
Roy Cross, I work for the British Council. I'm also a governor of a local school where we talk all the time about trajectories, flight paths, targets. I'm going to abuse some privileged information I have, Lucy, which is that earlier in the year you were in gentle political disagreement with your father about the foreword to the second edition of the book, right?
Yes.
And I don't know how that came out in the wash, but the penultimate chapter of the book has 5 principles of good education systems, and at some point in that chapter you say, very po-faced, I don't quite know why none of these actually apply to the UK at present. I think I remember that correctly, don't I? I wanted to push you a bit on, how did we end up where we are in terms of education, that you can travel around the world and establish 5 principles of good education systems, none of which apply to us?
Okay, great question. So one kind of very easy, cheeky answer, which it won't be my only answer, is that I set out to look at what top performing countries were doing that we were not already doing. So great stuff that is happening in England, and it is happening, was not something that I picked up on as being an explanation for why these countries are doing well. Perhaps, it's mea culpa, the right expression here, like perhaps I should have had 6 or 7. And they're just, some things I think are working. I don't think, if you do these 5 things, this is all you need to do, and this is everything, and this will make you top of PISA. So that aside, I think it's because education's been a bit of a political football in England. It's not been based on the evidence that we have, partly because around pedagogy, teachers themselves as a community are having big arguments about it, which makes it quite easy for politicians to say, well, there isn't a kind of clear body of knowledge saying this is how we should teach, because you're arguing about it on Twitter. So this is what we think, we'll push that. Partly the reason I wrote this book is I wanted can't quite say the general population, because there'll be a certain type of person that reads this, but more people, more parents, more school governors, more teachers who aren't normally involved in education policy, to understand both what's happening in these systems and some of the evidence behind it, so that, taking the indirect route, so that Theresa May can't say, we want more grammar schools, and that's going to help with social mobility, despite the fact that all the evidence suggests that grammar schools are not a help for social mobility. If more people know that, she can't get away with that as much. So it's partly my own small attempt to try and spread some of this stuff, which we do know, to a wider population. I'll stop there.
Christopher Reynolds, former secondary school head teacher and chair of governors of a special school for autism. I'm thinking about the exam system, the high value exams that we have at 16 and 18 in this country, and the fact that it doesn't matter how good we get, because we use the normative system, we'll get the same number of failures. I just wondered, the countries that you've been looking at, whether the same end product is there, and whether there's a backwash in this country because of that doesn't occur in other countries.
I think this question I'm going to defer to the man on my left, because he's an expert on this, and I could guess, but I'm not going to be as accurate as Tim.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I mean, this is often raised, the big problem in our system is A-levels. No other country has anything like A-levels. The washback effect is appalling. Actually, when you scratch beneath the surface of all other high-performing systems, you find things exactly like A-levels. In America, they have the AP, so kids actually accessing university now typically will go beyond high school and take between 3 and 4 AP before they go to university. If you go to Germany, you'll find a very broad curriculum, up to 14 subjects, but the examinations only exist in 3 subjects, 3 or 4 subjects, and they're exactly like A-levels. And I could go on and on about this. I mean, in Finland's exactly the same, and so on. But the key thing about this is that in Germany you have the broad curriculum, as well as many subjects are taught, and then you have these high-stakes examinations. Yeah, your point is about the normative approach to awarding, and yet more recently we've moved away from the attempt to introduce criterion reference assessment to actually linking year on year through statistics, so that even if all schools improve, we'll still have the same proportion of the various grades. That is true, and we're trapped in a not very good sort of technical situation at the moment, and we do need to look at that. If you're worried about the spread, you know, the fact that our examinations have a long tail of people getting very, very low grades, then we are very, very concerned about that. I mean, Simon and I look at the actual scripts that children write when they get an E grade in an A level, and at the things that they write when they previously got a G or now get a 1 in a GCSE. I advise more people to look at those scripts, to think that these kids have been through 11 years of compulsory schooling is a national scandal. And when I said we shouldn't be giving grades for that, there was an outbreak of shouting occurred in the room. Of course we should be continuing to measure the performance of these children. No, it is a savage indictment of our system that we have that curve and that long tail. And all the international surveys show that.
And I'd love to kind of add to that. I think part of the problem, the reason it's so difficult here, is less because of the assessment, more because of the accountability and the consequences of those assessments at a school level, rather than for the children. Obviously, there are impacts on the children as well, of course. Tim's kind of covered that point. But for the schools, I mean, I think so long as you have a system where if you aren't making above average progress, you might get turned into an academy, your head teacher might lose their job. It generates huge amounts of fear among schools, which means that you then are very narrowly looking for how do we kind of beat this mark scheme, or how can we tick all the boxes for Ofsted. I mean, thankfully, our new Ofsted Chief Inspector has come out to say we need to have a richer curriculum, stop trying to tick the boxes. But the reason for the ticking the boxes is because of the very high stakes nature of our accountability system for schools. And that is different to the countries that I went to, where there's definitely still school accountability. It's really important that the province or the government has data on how schools are getting on, but so that they know where to target support, rather than so they know who to fire. I think that's a key difference. You know, how do you make schools improve? Is it by trying to get teachers to work hard, which, I mean, we have a massive workload issue. They're already working pretty hard. Or is it introducing the kind of support, the knowledge, the capacity for them to improve? If they don't know how, working harder isn't going to help.
And that's a key myth about Finland. You know, no school national inspection, no national tests, no accountability. They do loads of testing in Finnish primary schools, and all of those data go through to the municipality. And if the teacher assessments and the tests show a serious decline over a period of time, then there is a supportive intervention by the municipality. There's loads of accountability. It's just not of the same form that we have here.
It's just supportive rather than punitive.
Yes, exactly. Now, there was a hand up over... Oh, now there are lots of hands up over there. That's the zone to take the mic.
Hi, I'm Rob Lowe from the Relational Schools Foundation. Hi, Lucy. We've been doing a lot of work in Australia in the last year. And one of the things that we found fascinating in Australia is that even though that they don't do very well in the PISA tables, or haven't done in the past, children from Southeast Asian contexts in the Australian system still do exceptionally well. Actually, if you could take them out as a data population by themselves, they'd actually be right up at the top of the PISA tables. So does that say more about the system, or does it say more about parents?
I think it's a bit of both. So partly it's the stuff I was talking about before with regards to the Confucian culture, that attitude to learning and effort. That I didn't go into great detail on that. It's a whole talk in itself, but that is partly encouraged by the way that parents respond to children and failure. Chinese parents are much more likely to point out failure or things that children have got wrong in homework, for example, but they're also much more likely to get involved in supporting them to improve. And I think this partly stems from certainly a belief in effort, but also I will use this term growth mindset if people don't mind me oversimplifying it. This idea that, well, they can improve, they can do better, and let me show you how. So I think that's really key. And so absolutely, that's cultural. But as Tim was saying right in the introduction, I think that that's the kind of culture that we can learn from and that we can introduce in our own schools. You can talk to parents about growth mindset. You can explain to them, how these things work. I don't know about anyone that's tried to do that, or interventions, or what the effect size was, but things like that, and teachers genuinely believing, talking to children in that way, talking about the importance of effort, telling stories about men that bore holes in walls and let through light. I think it's really important that we pick up on some of that. We're not going to I don't think England will ever get to the stage where we are performing in PISA as Singapore does, and I think nor would we want to, because the amount of work that children have to put in, I think I wouldn't want to send my children there, honestly. I think there's a lot to learn from them. There's a lot of really excellent teaching, but the pressure that comes from the cultural aspect and part of the system, as I mentioned earlier, I think is too much.
Right, you're going to fight amongst yourselves for the microphone over there. There were at least 3 hands up. Oh, and Anne. Right, okay. Right, we'll go for about another 10 minutes.
Anne Sparrowhawk recently retired from Cambridge Assessment, but also a governor at schools in Cottenham. Loved your book, really, really interesting. One of the things that has always fascinated me is where you see the role of language in all of this. And you didn't in your book very much talk about what the English component was of the assessments and the learning that the students were doing. And I'd be really interested to know how that fitted into their achievements.
So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Sorry, what do you mean by the English component?
Well, some of the tests are in English, is that not right?
English medium teaching.
In PISA, I mean, so they'll take it in the first language.
They take all the exams in their first language.
So Canada does. So some children take it in French in Quebec. They take it in English elsewhere.
Right.
In Singapore, they take it in English, but they have secondary mother tongue lessons. But they take it in English, and then most of their lessons are taught in English. Japan, it's Japanese. Shanghai, it's in Mandarin.
So, for example, in Singapore, I would be really interested to know how the English, their need to speak English in a context where they wouldn't normally, was introduced into school, and how that fits into the sort of the teacher's experience of teaching. I'm very conscious as a monoglot that I would singularly fail in that sort of context. So how does it work in those sort of cultures?
Yeah.
I'd be really interested in that.
So I think language and teaching in a second language is a real challenge for the fairness of PISA, I suppose. I've been doing quite a lot of work in Brunei recently, where they have English medium instruction. The children will be entering PISA in the next round in English, and they're at a real disadvantage because it's not their first language. They speak Bahasa Malay, which isn't even a written language, so they couldn't take it in that language. And I think they're going to do worse than they would do had they entered it in Malay, for example. But for many countries, I don't know whether I could say sensible or not, but it's a decision to educate children in English because it's a language of business, etc., etc. In Singapore, I think it's been an English medium for such a long time that the teachers all speak fluent English. It's not really a case of it being. So it may be a second language in that their parents might have spoken to them in Mandarin as children, but they've been speaking English in educational contexts their whole lives. So it's not a barrier for most teachers. And for students, well, they start as soon as they start school, it's in English, and then they have the second. I'm not actually very much answering the question. Tim, do you have anything to say on this? I think I'm failing at this one. I didn't see anything particularly special going on in Singapore in terms of teaching English, but then that wasn't a particular focus of mine, so I wasn't actively looking for it. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Huge amounts of research on do you learn more English language by having mixed English language medium, natural language combined. Very, very little evidence on whether that actually inhibits your subject learning. The couple of studies that exist suggest that actually it increases differences between groups. So those who have language facility accelerate by virtue of the combined English language, natural language, double medium teaching. Those that actually don't have a certain level of facility in, say, English, fall increasingly behind. Because if you're explaining something like gravity, you'll probably be using linguistic analogies. And if you don't understand the billiard ball, then you won't understand what on earth is going on. So lot that it's great for learning English. The most of the evidence on mixed medium teaching for subjects is that it can lead to increased differences between groups.
So I think that's another book to write. I think go and look at countries which are doing that. There are many of them.
Many countries are going now towards English medium tuition, either for all or some of the curriculum at quite an early age. It's quite a risk, actually. Right, couple of final questions. Oh, Jenny, right at the back. Oh, thanks, Les. Thank you.
Correda Katnak-Chell, I work at OCR and previous teacher. Two things spring to mind, having just started the postgrad certificate on assessment, educational assessment. You mentioned that firstly, testing and giving grades, which again, going through teaching feels very harsh, but from the age of 11 and Key Stage 2 levels, they're predicted into GCSEs and GCSEs Form A levels that we're actually almost putting a glass ceiling in for students from a very, very early age and setting them up in some ways to lose that belief of being able to sort of, you know, recognise they can achieve. And also the way we test in the UK is very heavily monitored and scrutinised and coming from an exam board. Any school assessment is immediately moderated and sort of normalised, whereas from what I understand from what you said in the other systems, that actually the teacher assessment up to the age of 16 or even 18 is paramount and not necessarily scrutinised by external agencies in the same way as ours. And therefore are we at a point where we almost need a reboot of the education system as it currently stands to build in some of the principles that you talked about?
So absolutely agree on the glass ceiling thing. We are putting glass ceilings on students, and it's from even before 11. It's from when they first come into school, when I put in the blue group or the green group, you know, and they know what that means. They get easier work, they get it. And too often they stay there. I cannot remember the exact figure, but there has been research on this. And if you are in the slower group in primary school, you will be in the lowest set in year 11. So yes, absolutely agree with that. On teacher assessment, so it is still moderated in these countries. So in Finland, where it's teacher assessment, which leads to whether or not you get into particular sixth forms, it's still moderated. So it's moderated certainly within school, but then the district will also organise moderation externally too. And they'll actually take a sample of students every year in every subject and give them a test and then see how the results of that test compare to the teacher given grades. So there is a lot of moderation, just so to make sure it's reliable. The difference is that because in Finland it's not high stakes accountability for the school, there's not a mixed incentive for the teacher. So here, if you're giving a coursework grade, you have a strong incentive, because your head teacher has said they all need to do well in their coursework, you have a strong incentive to inflate that grade rather than try and be reliable. So I think again, the issue is accountability rather than assessment.
Okay, final question, I think. Yep.
Thank you. Chris Dale, I'm Director of Teaching and Learning for the Samuel Ward Academy Trust. Just interested in focusing on a particular aspect of school culture, and that being behaviour and expectations for behaviour. Obviously, there's been quite a lot of stuff in the press in the relative recent past about behaviour in our secondary schools, and that being the elephant in the room in terms of limiting pupil progress. Obviously, there's also a movement among some schools to develop a culture of compliance, zero tolerance, that kind of stuff. I'm just interested to get your perceptions about what that looks like, particularly in the secondary phase around the systems that you studied.
So I'm actually, if you don't mind, going to draw on evidence experience from America, where I've just been, rather than these countries. So the difficulty with the behaviour is if you go in not on day one, you don't see the norm setting. You don't see that you just walk in and they're all lovely and beautifully behaved. Having said that, in every single country I went to, I saw some lessons in which the kids were pretty badly behaved. So what that says to me is it's not that just Finnish kids are intrinsically naturally angels, that the schools are doing something, and it partly depends on the teacher. So in China, I saw the same group of children behaving beautifully and behaving appallingly in two different lessons because it's two different teachers. So like anywhere, partly it's to do with the teacher and the amount of authority that they manage to establish in their classroom. At a school systems level, though, I do think it's about, like, as I was saying before, the socialisation in the first few weeks of school is really important in terms of explicitly teaching the kind of behaviours that you expect. And when children are new to a school, it's much easier to do that because it's not the case that they're trying to show off in front of all their friends because, well, if everyone's doing that because we've got you before you've kind of made those kind of some of the more negative social influences, then we've got you. And I was in a charter school in New York 2 days ago. And it was quite stunning, actually, in terms of I've been to a few public schools where the behaviour wasn't terrible, but, you know, quite loud, quite a lot of off-task, not really looking. And then went into this charter school and saw the difference where as soon as the kids came in, they were on task. There are lots of little tricks. I mean, it's happening in this country in some schools. But teacher, class, and the class go, yes, yes, and then immediately they're quiet. And it's just kind of training right from the beginning of school, making that a priority before you actually even start your maths or your English. So it's probably stuff you all knew already, but yeah, that's what I have to say on that one.
Thank you, Lucy.
Do you have anything to add, Tim?
No, I think that's absolutely fine. I want to add something about the book. So, as I said, there are some copies. I was having a conversation with a teacher who was really struggling in her primary school. She was a newly appointed head, previously just a teacher within the school. And she was talking about some of the issues around the huge disparity in maths attainment in this very small primary school. And so I said, we haven't got time to discuss it this evening, but I'll copy you a particular chapter from Lucy's book. I really commend it to you because it'll give you some really good insights. So a week later I said, have you read it? And she said, no, I haven't got time. And a week after that I said, have you had time to read that yet? And she said, no, I've had to put it on one side because there are so many things to do. And I went back a month later and said, you really need to read that because you can change this culture amongst your teachers and your kids in relationship to mathematics. And she said, yeah, but I've got so many other things to do. So, can I say, Lucy, thank you so much for giving us deep insight, not only into what you've written, but also into so many places in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So keep an eye on the website, information coming soon. There'll be something from next lecture from Simon Peyton-Jones. Indeed. Thank you very much for coming. And thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Liz.